by scratching the surface, you get a terrible shock. It's such it's a heinous crime. People are so shocked by what.
The palace did not tremble because of shouting, it trembled because of silence behind closed doors. Prince William stood over a file that had changed everything, his hand resting on the edge of a polished table, as if steadying himself against betrayal. By nightfall, Camilla's family had been banned from palace access, and the monarchy was facing a wound no ceremony could hide. William did not turn the first page quickly. He read it once, then again, as if the words might correct themselves if he stared long enough, but they did not. The trust documents, legal papers used to protect royal estate rights, family privileges, and private access rules carried language that should never have been there. Names that appeared where no names were meant to appear. Access had widened where limits had once been firm. What began as paperwork became a warning, and the prince understood that the danger was not only what had changed, it was who might have known. Camilla heard the decision in a private sitting room, and for several seconds she said nothing. The queen consort gripped the arm of her chair, not in rage, not yet, but in disbelief so sharp it left her still. William had formally banished her family from palace residences, private offices, guest records, and ceremonial access after discovering that trust documents connected to royal estate privileges had been altered. The order was direct, the meaning was brutal. Her family was no longer being treated as guests close to the crown. They were being treated as a risk to it. A senior courtier placed two versions of the same trust schedule side by side, and the room seemed to tighten around the difference. One version held the original wording, the other carried expanded clauses, broader hospitality permissions, and a handwritten correction that sat on the page like a fingerprint. The crown, in plain terms, meant the institution of monarchy itself, the protected system of royal duty, property, and authority that survives beyond any one person. William saw that system exposed. Camilla saw her private world pulled into judgment. Charles, somewhere between them, faced the impossible weight of both. The decision was not framed as revenge. That made it colder. William treated it as protection, a hard move to defend the monarchy's internal boundaries after a private inheritance mechanism appeared to have been manipulated. Yet the banishment was only the visible act behind it. Waited the deeper question, the one no one in the palace could safely ignore, who altered the documents, who benefited from the change, and who inside those walls stayed silent before William found out. Before William could confront the paper trail, he had to face the people whose names were written into the scandal. Every scandal has signatures, but this one had faces. Camilla's children, long kept at the careful edge of royal life, suddenly became the center of a palace reckoning. William saw more than altered wording. He saw a private circle moving closer to royal privilege. Charles saw a marriage under siege, and Camilla saw her family being pushed outside the gates. William understood that the palace was not only a home, it was a boundary, a symbol, and a fortress of trust. After finding the altered access language, the prince no longer viewed the issue as a private misunderstanding that could be softened behind closed doors. He saw a dangerous blur between royal duty and personal advantage. Every invitation, every quiet entry, every familiar name on a guest record now carried a different meaning. What had once seemed like courtesy had become evidence. What had once looked like family closeness now looked like a path toward influence. Camilla felt that change immediately, and it cut deeper than any public criticism ever could. Her family had never stood at the center of the monarchy, yet they had lived close enough to feel its warmth. Private dinners, discreet visits, and palace familiarity had allowed them to exist near royal life without carrying royal duty. Now, that same closeness was being turned against them. The queen consort insisted they should not be treated like intruders, but her voice weakened when William answered that palace trust records were not a matter of affection. The words landed hard because they left no room for sentiment. Charles sat with a file in front of him and slowly removed his glasses, setting them beside the page as if the gesture might delay what was coming. The king could feel the collision taking shape. On one side stood his son, firm and unyielding, determined to protect the walls he would one day inherit. On the other stood his wife, wounded by the suggestion that her family's presence had crossed into something improper. Charles wanted time, he wanted review, he wanted language softer than banishment, but William had already seen enough to know that delay could become denial. Then the private access ledger changed the air in the room. Certain entries had appeared after the original trust instructions were archived, creating a timeline William could not ignore. One name appeared once and again, then a third time across separate access amendments, each placement drawing the circle tighter. A family dispute was becoming something far more serious, a possible internal breach of royal governance. And as Charles tried to slow the confrontation, William prepared to ask the one question everyone in the room feared: who authorized the changes? And the answer began not with the altered documents themselves, but with an earlier moment everyone had chosen to overlook. The palace did not arrive at this crisis in a single night. It began with a dinner invitation that seemed harmless, almost forgettable, until one detail later became impossible to explain. A private Windsor supper, a missing seating note, and a brief conversation near the old family portraits became the trigger that led William straight to the altered trust documents. At first, the evening carried the kind of calm the palace knew how to create. Everything appeared controlled. Every seat, every greeting, every quiet exchange seemed belonged to the old rhythm of royal life. But beneath that calm, something had already shifted. Camilla's family members were placed closer to senior royal advisors than expected, despite not appearing on the original private guest schedule. That detail mattered because private guest schedules were never casual lists. They shaped who could move near power, who could speak near decision-makers, and who could be treated as familiar in side rooms built on trust. Catherine noticed it before anyone said a word about documents. She watched William's expression change when one guest spoke casually about standing access, as though the phrase belonged in ordinary conversation. It did not. Standing access meant a lasting permission to enter certain royal spaces without needing fresh approval each time. And it was a kind of phrase that belonged inside internal trust correspondence, not beside a dinner plate. William said nothing. The prince kept his composure, because one careless reaction could have warned the wrong person that he had heard too much. Later, away from the table, William asked Catherine whether she had heard the same phrase. She did not need a long answer. Her quiet nod told him everything. The future queen understood that this was no longer about manners, seating, or palace warmth. It was about language escaping from protected files into private mouths. That single remark became the spark. William requested the original trust archive, the protected collection of older legal instructions used to confirm what royal estate rules originally allowed. Once the archive was opened, the damage began to reveal itself. The original file was stricter. It limited access. Carefully, it treated privilege as something controlled, not assumed, but the newer version carried expanded wording, including approved family, guess a phrase, missing from the archive instructions. A junior aide later found the missing seating note and matched its language to the revised access memo, tying a social arrangement to a formal palace privilege. In that moment, confusion died. A dinner invitation had become evidence. A casual phrase had become a warning. And once William connected the Windsor supper remark to the altered wording, confrontation was no longer a choice. So when William finally entered the room with the evidence, no one could pretend the damage was accidental anymore. The confrontation was not loud at first. That made it worse. William placed the two trust documents on the table, one original and one altered, and let the silence accuse everyone before he spoke. Camilla looked at the pages. Charles looked at his son, and the room seemed to shrink around a single unbearable truth. Someone had crossed a royal line. William did not begin with emotion. He began with proof. The prince laid the original trust wording beside the altered version, making the difference impossible to hide behind polite phrases or family explanations. A trust document, in simple terms, was a legal instruction that controlled who could benefit from private royal estate arrangements and who could receive access connected to them. That was why the change mattered. It did not merely adjust a sentence. It shifted power. It turned a protected rule into a doorway, and William believed that doorway had been opened for people who were never meant to pass through it. Camilla pushed her chair back slightly, and the sound seemed to cut through the room. She asked whether he was accusing her family, but her anger carried something more fragile beneath it: hurt, fear, shame. The queen consort had endured criticism before, yet this was different because it came from inside the family and carried the weight of official action. William answered carefully, almost coldly, that he was not there to punish affection. He was there to protect the institution from unauthorized privilege. The words struck harder because they sounded final before the decision had even been spoken. Charles tried to step between them with the quiet desperation of a man watching two parts of his life collide. The king said the matter could be reviewed discreetly, that private damage did not need public consequence, that time might soften what the file had exposed, but William refused delay. The palace records had already changed access, had already widened names, had already moved from courtesy into structure. The future king knew that once a false permission became normal, removing it later would look like cruelty instead of correction. Then the senior legal advisor confirmed what everyone feared: the altered language had created a practical pathway for Camilla's family to enter private spaces, estate lodging arrangements, and ceremonial guest privileges that the original trust structure did not allow. Camilla's face changed as the meaning settled. Charles looked down, wounded by the truth he could not easily challenge, and William revealed the signed banishment order, already prepared, already sealed by resolve. This was not a warning. It was a decision. Camilla understood it first, and Charles was left with the choice. No father wanted to face a Pose's heir or accept the humiliation in silence. But William's authority in that room did not come from anger. It came from the hidden machinery of royal control. Power in the monarchy rarely announces itself with raised voices. It appears in signature seals, archive instructions, and the one person allowed to act when private privilege threatens public duty. William did not simply banish a family because he was offended. He moved because the structure beneath the crown gave him the authority to close doors others had quietly opened. William understood that the decision would be judged by more than emotion. The prince was the senior heir, the person expected to guard the future shape of royal estate integrity before he ever wore the crown. That responsibility mattered because royal estates were not ordinary homes, and private access was not ordinary hospitality. Trust documents controlled who could enter protected spaces, who could receive lodging tied to royal property, and who could stand close enough to influence the life behind palace walls. If those papers could be softened by family pressure, then the monarchy itself could be quietly bent without the public ever seeing a hand that moved it. A senior courtier watched William sign the final restriction notice and saw how controlled he remained. His hand did not shake, but his jaw tightened before the pen touched the page. That single movement said what the prince would not say aloud. He knew the order would wound Camilla. He knew it would place Charles in an almost impossible position. Yet, he also knew that hesitation would make the altered wording feel acceptable, and acceptance was the one thing he could not allow. The restriction notice was not just a ban. It was a warning written in official language. Charles stood nearby, torn in a way no title could protect him from. The king had spent years trying to build a household that could survive old resentment, public doubt, and private pain. Now every line William signed felt like a judgment on that fragile peace. Charles did not see only documents. He saw his wife's humiliation, his son's hardening resolve, and the painful truth that love could not erase the damage caused by altered authority. The monarch wanted unity, but the file demanded discipline. Then the palace legal team delivered the final blow once the alteration had been identified. Allowing the expanded access to continue would make the monarchy appear complicit. Reversing the banishment later would be nearly impossible without suggesting the order had been political rather than protective. William heard that and understood the trap. If he acted, the family fractured. If he paused, the crown weakened. So he chose a fracture, because a wounded family could still survive, but a compromised institution might not. With the order sealed, the palace no longer had the luxury of treating the matter as private tension. It had to enforce the decision, and the first person to feel its force was not Camilla's family, but Camilla herself. The paper had been signed, but the true fallout began when the doors actually started closing. The first consequence came without spectacle. A name was checked, a pause followed, and the palace door that had opened for years remained closed. That was when the banishment stopped being a document and became a reality. Camilla's family was no longer being discussed in private rooms. They were being refused at thresholds that once welcomed them without question. Palace staff moved quickly because William's order had left no soft edges. Updated access instructions reached the people who control private residence permissions, guest corridors, estate lodging lists, and internal ceremonial planning records. These details mattered because palace access was never just about walking through a door. It meant trust. It meant nearness. It meant being allowed into spaces where private conversations could shape public duty. Once Camilla's family was removed from those systems, their place near royal life changed instantly. The order was not symbolic. It was operational, and that made it devastating. Camilla watched an aide deliver the updated access notice, and for a moment, she seemed almost calm. The queen consort sat completely still as the words were explained. Her expression controlled her silence sharper than protest, but when the aide left and the door closed, the composure slipped. The humiliation was not only personal, it was official. Her family had not merely been embarrassed by William's decision, they had been erased from the quiet channels that had once made them feel accepted inside the palace world. Charles found her alone afterward, and the king carried the helpless sadness of a man who knew comfort would not be enough. He tried to reach her with careful words, but she turned away before he could soften the wound. Camilla did not need sympathy in that moment. She needed the meaning of the order to disappear, and that was the one thing Charles could not give her. William had overruled her in a way no private reassurance could undo, and the monarch knew that every closed door would now sound like his son's authority. Then came the confirmation that made the banishment impossible to bend. The palace security officer quietly stated that the new restrictions applied even to informal visits, removing the possibility of backdoor exceptions. No private call, no familiar name, no old habit could reopen the route. Soon after, one family representative was stopped at a private gate, and the first visible sign of enforcement moved through the household like a chill. The decision was alive now at hands. It had consequences. And as Camilla absorbed the new reality, William began to face the personal cost of the order in a private moment. He could not delegate. Behind the hard edge of authority, William still had to explain what this decision had taken from him. After the orders, after the signatures, after the palace gates began obeying his command, William stepped into a quieter room and stopped being the future king for a moment. With Catherine beside him, and no advisors between them, the weight of the decision finally reached him. He had protected the crown, but he had also wounded his father's house. William had carried the decision with steel in public, but silence forced him to feel what authority had hidden away from lawyers, courtier staff, and royal protocol. The prince no longer had to speak like an heir defending an institution. He could speak like a son who had watched his father absorb a blow. He could not stop. That mattered because his banishment was never only about access. It had protected trust documents, yes, but it had also deepened the fracture between duty and blood. William had acted to save the rules, yet the rules had cut straight through the family. Catherine listened without interrupting because she understood the kind of pain that arrives after strength. William admitted that Charles looked older when the order was read, and that memory troubled him more than Camilla's anger. The queen consort's fury had been expected. His father's quiet defeat had not. The king had stood there caught between the woman he loved and the son who would inherit everything he was trying to preserve. William could still hear the pause before Charles spoke. He could still feel the room waiting for the monarch to resist. But Charles had not stopped him, and somehow that silence hurt more than opposition. William placed a file on a side table, as if even touching it had become too much. Then he told Catherine the truth. He could not soften for anyone else. The monarchy could not survive if private affection rewrote public responsibility. Catherine did not challenge him. She reminded him that the altered trust documents had not merely changed access. They had changed the moral balance of who was allowed near protected royal inheritance. That was why the decision mattered beyond Camilla's family. It proved whether royal privilege could still be held inside firm boundaries, or whether closeness to power could quietly become power itself. Then William made the next choice. The palace would release a controlled statement confirming a review of private access protocols, but it would not expose every family detail. That decision carried its own danger. Too little information would invite suspicion. Too much would tear the household apart in public. Catherine understood the risk, and William understood the storm waiting beyond the walls. The private wound was about to become a public test, and once the world saw the shape of the banishment, no one inside the palace would control the story completely. By morning, the palace silence had become a headline. What began as a private order now belonged to the public imagination, and every photograph of the gates seemed to carry a new meaning. People did not need to see the documents to understand the symbolism. William had drawn a line. Camilla had been isolated, and Charles stood between love and legacy. The palace tried to control the damage with careful language, but careful language could not hide the force of what had happened. A measured statement confirmed revised private access protocols after an internal review of trust-related records. In simple terms, access protocols were the rules deciding who could enter private royal areas, appear on guest lists, receive estate hospitality, or move near protected family spaces. That mattered because the statement did not name Camilla's family, yet it confirmed the seriousness of the action. The monarchy was not denying the breach. It was admitting that something inside its own walls had required correction. Broadcasters seized on the silence between the lines. They framed the story as a defining test of William's authority and Charles's ability to keep unity inside the royal household. The prince was described as firm, almost ruthless, but also impossible to ignore. The king was presented as wounded, caught in the hardest place a monarch can stand between the woman he loves and the heir who believes love has already cost the crown too much. Each report sharpened the same painful contrast. William looked like control. Charles looked like sorrow. Camilla looked suddenly alone. Charles watched the morning coverage without speaking, one hand resting near the remote as though he could stop the damage by pressing a button, but he did not turn it off. Every sentence seemed to deepen the wound because every sentence made the private decision feel permanent. Camilla heard her family discussed as symbols of overreach, and the queen consort quietly left before the final segment ended. She had faced public judgment before, but this time the criticism carried palace authority behind it that made it colder, that made it harder to dismiss. Then one newspaper front page captured the national mood. It showed Buckingham Palace gates under the headline, "The line William would not move," with a smaller caption. Beneath it, trust papers spark royal banishment. Outside the palace, a crowd gathered not in celebration, but intense curiosity, as reporters repeated that the order had already been enforced. The image was simple, but the meaning was brutal. Doors had closed, names had been removed, a private family fracture had become a public symbol of royal discipline. Public sympathy split in three directions: toward Charles's pain, Camilla's humiliation, and William's resolve. Yet beneath the noise, the final judgment was already forming around one question: what does a monarchy protect when love and duty collide? When the noise finally settled, one truth remained stronger than every headline, every denial, and every broken family bond. In the end, this was not only a story about altered trust documents. It was a story about the moment William chose a crown over comfort, boundaries over sentiment, and duty over silence. Camilla's family was banished from the palace, but the deeper exile belonged to the illusion that private influence could move through royal walls without consequence. William understood that the crisis had changed the monarchy in ways no public statement could soften. The crown, in plain terms, meant the royal institution itself, its duty, authority, inheritance, and protected place in national life. That mattered because this decision was bigger than one household argument. Stricter private access controls now stood where quiet favors had once survived. Clearer trust protections replaced old assumptions. Personal relationships could no longer override written inheritance boundaries, simply because they were wrapped in family warmth. Charles accepted the outcome with quiet sorrow, and that sorrow carried its own verdict. The king knew his son had not attacked his marriage. William had defended the institution Charles himself had inherited, even if the defense left the monarch wounded in his own home. That was why the pain cut so deeply. A father watched his heir do what duty demanded, while a husband had watched his wife's family push beyond the palace wall. Success and suffering stood side by side, and neither one canceled the other. Camilla remained wounded by the banishment, but the queen consort could no longer mistake closeness for entitlement. The palace had been around private comfort for too long, and now its protected structures refused to bend any further. The altered documents were preserved as part of the internal record, not as gossip, not as rumor, but as proof of the moment royal boundaries nearly slipped from a monarchy's control. Trust protections were legal safeguards that determined who could receive access, benefit, or permission tied to royal estates. And once those safeguards were challenged, the palace had only one choice: restore the line or lose the meaning of it. William's final instruction was simple: an absolute no private family name will be added again, the protected access records, without full legal review and direct authorization. The prince did not speak it like a threat. He spoke it like a closing seal. His decision became a defining act of future kingship, severe, painful, and impossible to ignore. The final verdict was clear. William's banishment of Camilla's family was not cruelty. It was a royal line drawn in permanent ink, proving that the crown can survive personal pain only when duty is stronger than desire. And with that final order, the palace doors closed not just on Camilla's family, but on an old way of power that could never return. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next.